right after the other. 16.
Great, yep. So we have attendees have filed in. Our own Stephen Rode and James Lafferty are there. Okay, so we are live, and Sharon, whenever you're comfortable.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sharon Kyle, and I am with the Los Angeles Local Committee to Defend Julian Assange. We're here this evening to have a panel discussion. We're calling this discussion Julian Assange in his own words. Julian Assange, founder and publisher of WikiLeaks, faces the threat of extradition from the United Kingdom to the United States, where he faces up to 175 years in prison on charges of publishing evidence of war crimes and abuse in 2010. Assange has been charged with 17 counts under the Espionage Act, the first ever espionage charges for publication. The United States Department of Justice issued a second superseding indictment yesterday against Assange, adding no new charges, but attempting to cast doubt on Assange's status as a journalist. Today, we are helping Julian Assange have a voice in the international discussion of his persecution with a panel event focused on Assange's own words. We will hear speeches and interviews from Assange from the last 10 years. Between these video clips, we'll hear from legal analysts, activists, who will provide context and expand on Assange's comments. We'll be joined by Robert Corsini, Nathan Fuller, Vince DeStefano, and Marjorie Cohn. Each of them will tell you a little bit about themselves and then present their views. Before they begin, I would like to explain to you how the Q&A session will work. Each of the presenters will give their analysis, followed by the next presenter. We will have a Q&A period afterwards. And the way that you'll submit your questions depends on whether you are viewing from Zoom or if you are viewing on YouTube, which would be the Courage Foundation YouTube channel. On the Zoom call, there is a Q&A. If you move your cursor, move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see Q&A. And that's where you will be submitting your questions or comments. And in the YouTube, you will be submitting your questions in the comments field at the bottom of the screen. Now, without any further ado, we will begin with our first presenter, Robert Corsini. Robert Corsini is an activist and a video journalist, and he's going to give you a little bit more about his bio. Without any further ado, Robert, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Sharon. Again, since we're focused on Julian and his words, I'm going to try and minimize my role here as much as I can, but there's some very important things to understand and to set up. First, thanks all to everyone who is here today to participate in this. As we get further into this process, it's been several months now that we've been working as a team. We are learning day in and day out new insights into what has been happening with Julian Assange, and we are here to share some of that with you, both in terms of our perspectives and what we've learned, and of course, the video itself. And there's a lot of it out there, and we took it upon ourselves to sort through it, curate, and find some of the most compelling moments that are really indicative of the greatest issues that are at hand here facing Julian Assange and facing issues of freedom of the press here in the United States and around the world, and above all, transparency to the malfeasance of governments that are ongoing and highly problematic, as we can see all around us today. For over a decade, the work of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange has literally shaken the foundations of Western state hegemony, WikiLeaks and their revelations of truth have challenged the greatest powers on earth in their designs for warfare and suppression of democracy, and especially freedom of the press. Julian Assange, in his own words, in this collection, we have been very careful to curate a range of video clips and interviews intended to demonstrate, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the great injustices being done to Julian that strikes at the very heart of democracy itself. It's an equal opportunity travesty that crosses borders and political and religious affiliations. Our first video is a compilation of WikiLeaks' collateral murder release that was the keynote document of the 2010 Iraq War revelations. It depicts a 2007 US helicopter gunship attack that killed and maimed 18 civilians in Baghdad, including 2 Reuters journalists, and who were mistaken for combatants because they happen to be carrying cameras. Imagine that. Children also were part of the devastation. This video exposes a very dark side of America that we're seeing more and more about, one that is very hard to watch and even harder to accept. And as a footnote, I want people to understand, it's critical, this video was transformative when it was first released. It was the flagship document that came out of the Iraq war logs. To this day, uploading this video is problematic. Literally last night, I uploaded this video and it was pulled down before it was even published by YouTube. So they are tracking this. They don't want this out there. And we will see right now the reasons why. Stand by. Oh yeah.
Anybody's been development, copy at white 6.
That's a weapon. Yeah.
Force 1 have 5 to 6 individuals with AK-47s. Request permission to engage. Roger that. We have no personnel east of our position, so you are free to engage over. All
right, we'll be engaging.
Roger, go ahead. I can't get them now because they're behind that building. Anybody's been development? We got an RPG. All right, we got a guy with an RPG. Coming to fire. Let's come around. Your element got about 4 Humvees out along your clear. All right, firing. What's the state line? Let me know when you have it. Or shoot. Light them all up. Come on, fire. You're right. We need to move time now. All right, we just engaged all 8 individuals. We got 2 birds. We're still firing. Sorry, got him. 6 is the 2-6. We're moving. We got 5. Oh, sorry. Well, God damn it, Kyle. Sorry. I get my text. All right, you're clear. I'm just trying to find targets again. Yeah, we got 1 guy crawling around down there, but we could definitely get him. US 18, this is Hotel 26 over. They're currently engaging approximately 8 individuals, AIA, RPGs, and AK-47. Roger, we got that. Come on, buddy. We gotta do is pick up a weapon. Where's that man at? Right down there by the body. Okay, yeah. Postmaster Crazy Horse, we have individuals going to the scene. Looks like possibly picking up bodies and weapons. Hey, we need to stop that. We need to get down there. We need to stop that. Roger. Break. Crazy Horse 1, request permission to engage. Get up the wounded. Come on, let us shoot. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1-8. You're taking him. Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1-8. Bushmaster 7, go ahead. Roger, we have a black got him. Take the fans disabled. Let's shoot it. I got an azimuth limit for some reason. Left. Crazy horse, your late Bradley just turned south on the road where all the engagements happen. Should have a van in the middle of the road with about 12 to 15 bodies. Oh yeah, look at that, right through the windshield.
So there you have it. You can never watch that video, no matter how many times you've seen it, and not be profoundly disturbed by what it depicts. And it is our mission to continue to communicate the severity of what is being shown here. And I wanted, the next video we chose was to hear exactly what Julian had to say upon this video's release as part of the Iraq war logs being released on October 22nd, 2010. And the next video I'm going to put on screen here is from that press conference where Julian explains just what the mission is here in releasing this kind of material.
This disclosure is about the truth. Philip Knightley, the great investigative reporter and Australian who for the past 30 or 40 years has made the UK his home, said that the first casualty of war is the truth. But the attack on the truth by war begins long before war starts and continues long after a war ends. In our release of these 400,000 documents about the Iraq war, the intimate detail of that war from the US perspective, we hope to correct some of that attack on the truth that occurred before the war, during the war, and which has continued on since the war officially concluded. In that material, the deaths of some 109,000 people are documented. Internally declared, 66,000 civilians. Working with the Iraq body count, we have seen that there are approximately 15,000 never previously documented or known cases of civilians who have been killed by violence in Iraq. That tremendous scale should not make us blind to the small human scale that occurs in this material. In fact, it is the deaths of 1 and 2 people per event that killed the overwhelming number of people in Iraq. Following our release of the Afghan War Diaries, we thought we would try and pull together a broader coalition, not just involving print, but one that had the emotionality and impact of TV, journalism, and extra research from other groups. So we structured a collaboration between The Guardian, Spiegel, New York Times, our 3 previous print partners, and new groups, the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, the Iraq Body Count, whose knowledge of deaths in Iraq is unsurpassed, SVT, the Swedish television, Al Jazeera, Channel 4, BBC Radio, and I'm sure I've missed some others. Yes, Le Monde. That collaboration seems to have worked. And we'll see over the next few days what's to be made of it. But so far, we can see a fairly strong response. We have seen, as of 3 a.m. This morning, 1,500 articles according to Google News, and of course, all around the world, we can see the result. We make a promise to our sources who go through incredible risks sometimes to get us material that we will do justice to their efforts and get them the maximum political impact possible. And while I'm not sure that we have achieved the maximum possible, I think we're getting pretty close.
So with that idea, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange embarked upon a journey that has been many years now. 10 years have transpired since that moment. And I want to take this opportunity to introduce our next speaker, who is Nathan Fuller. He's Executive Director of the Courage Foundation, an international whistleblower support group. Their website, defend.wikileaks.org, is their URL. He'll be discussing WikiLeaks' redefinition of journalism. What does it mean today in this era of extreme surveillance that we are all facing and becoming a subject to? But first, before we go there, I want to take a moment here and play a clip from the 60 Minutes interview that Steve Croft did with Julian Assange shortly after the release of the Iraq war logs. I think it really indicates a clash of journalistic style, to say the least. And it's a very powerful moment. And I think we believe that it shows and it speaks a lot to what is happening in terms of journalism today in America.
Given all the attention that Assange has received, we were curious about how he thought he was being perceived in the United States. He told us he hasn't had the time to give it much thought. Do you want me to give you my characterization of what I think people think?
Sure.
Mysterious, little weird, a cult-like figure, a little paranoid.
Well, you're repeating all the ad hominem attacks by our critics. My role when I do something like speak about that we have discovered the deaths of 109,000 individual people in Iraq, 15,000 civilian casualties never before reported anywhere. That's a very serious role. That is not a role where I can engage in humor. So I'm not used to performing under the spotlight, and I'm learning this as time is going by.
You have shown a fair amount of contempt for the mainstream press over the years. Why did you decide to, as you used the word, partner with them in some of these most recent releases?
We're a small organization. We're in a position, say, with Cablegate, where we have 3,000 volumes of material that are very important to get out to the public in a responsible manner, that have the potential for great change. For example, this recent revolution in Tunisia. It is logistically impossible. So instead, our organization delegates its excess source material to other journalists who will have more impact and who will do a better job.
There is an element of the press, most of the mainstream press, nobody wants to see you prosecuted because it could affect the way that they do their business. But there's also a feeling within the community that you're not one of them, that you play a different game.
We do play a different game, and I hope we're a new way.
The point that they're making, I think, is that you're not you're a publisher, but you're also an activist.
We're a particular type of activist. In the US context, there seems to be communist activists or something. So
right, agitator. Somebody who's more interested in...
It's a dirty word in the US.
It's a dirty word. People think that what you're trying to do is to sabotage the workings of government.
No, we're not that type of activists. We are free press activists. It's not about saving the whales. It's about giving people the information they need to support whaling or not support whaling. Why? That is the raw ingredients that is needed to make a just and civil society. And without that, you're just sailing in the dark.
For somebody who abhors secrets, you run a pretty secret organization.
That's not true. What we want is transparent government, not transparent people. We are an organization who, one of our primary goals is to keep certain things secret, to keep the identities of sources secret. Secrecy is an inherent part of our operation.
The State Department would make the same argument. They have doing very sensitive work that they're trying to make peace and negotiate situations around the world very delicately. It's important that they do this in secrecy. What's the difference?
And we don't say that the State Department should have no secrets. That's not what we say. Rather, we say that if there are people in the State Department who say that there is some abuse going on, and there's not a proper mechanism for internal accountability and external accountability, they must have a conduit to get that out to the public. And we are the conduit.
And now Nathan Fuller is going to jump in.
Thanks, Robert. So this 60 Minutes segment is a nice microcosm of some aspects of what's gone on in the nearly 10 years since that interview took place. And it shows Assange's foresight as well as the double standards that he's been held to. But as far as the microcosm of the last decade, we have a 60 Minutes journalist, a fellow journalist, repeating the same character smears that they've been tossing around in an attempt to make this about Julian as a person rather than about his work. We have 60 Minutes journalist Steve Croft, who wants to talk about whether Julian is a little weird or paranoid. And Julian stays focused on the revelations. These are thousands of previously uncounted civilian casualties. And these are extremely serious revelations, and Croft wants to talk about his personality. And that's why the Sweden narrative was so effective, and that's why the Trump and Russia narrative is so effective. And this is actually what the DOJ is trying to do in their new indictment. This is what that new indictment effectively does. Without adding any charges, without any actually new evidence, only using the testimony from a discredited Icelandic conman, the DOJ gets to put out a press release, which then creates a whole slate of new headlines all about Assange as a person. The additions to this new indictment are ostensibly about the computer intrusion charge, the 18th after the 17 espionage ones, but they're really trying to paint all of his journalistic work as that of a hacker. So they write about him speaking at hacker conferences and communicating with sources as if these are nefarious conspiratorial activities rather than a journalist doing things a little differently. And all the while, there are 17 charges still under the Espionage Act. 3 of them are what are called pure publication charges for publishing evidence of war crimes. So the DOJ is saying, look over here, look at this 2009 hacker conference. This means he's not a journalist. Meanwhile, with the other hand, they're attempting to decimate the First Amendment. But then, so Croft's next question gets at why fellow reporters are willing to go along, or have been before that, before this last year, have been willing to go along with this narrative. He says that you've shown contempt for mainstream media figures, just as Croft is doing the very thing for which Assange holds them in contempt. Though, to be fair, thankfully, over the last year, as the indictment that Julian said all along would be there has been unsealed, and other reporters can see how dangerous it is, I'm thankful to say that there really is widespread recognition that the US prosecution has stepped way over the line. But nevertheless, Julian's been held to a variety of double standards. You say you don't like mainstream media, but here you are working with them. Well, WikiLeaks partnered with mainstream media outlets in order to give the revelations the wide release and the publication that they deserved. He organized a widespread partnership that allowed newspapers and magazines in dozens of countries to report on what matters to their local populations, as well as providing an overall international context. And then Croft says things like, you love transparency, but you keep your own secrets, as if a journalistic outlet like this one and an elected government should be held to the exact same standards. So Assange says we do things a different way. We play a different game. And you can't really argue, I don't think, that WikiLeaks has changed journalism. It's now standard practice for news outlets around the world to have secure drop or another anonymized submission system to allow sources to provide them with secret documents. The Washington Post has an article when they announced the use of secure drop, and its headline is, "Here's how to leak government documents to the Washington Post." And former Post journalist Barton Gellman is one of 3 journalists that Snowden gave his NSA documents to, has said the indictment of Assange would criminalize basic journalistic activities that he engages in all the time. And so Assange's final words are about WikiLeaks' activism, giving people the information they need to make informed decisions about their government, about their society. And this is why the DOJ is willing to go after him. This is what makes him truly dangerous in their eyes. WikiLeaks is beholden to us, to the people, as a journalist should be. That's why we say this isn't just about one person. This is why we say Assange's right to publish is our right to know. If you don't think your government should be allowed to kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians in secret with your tax dollars in your name, if you think we should know about that, and we need to know about it to ever have a chance to stop it, you have to support the journalistic efforts that make those secret crimes public. So I'm going to turn it back to Robert to get on to the next video.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. Back up here. Sorry for that little drop there. So our next theme is about character smears and media distortions. And our speaker is Vincent DeStefano. He's been involved in social justice and human rights activism for the past 4 decades. He is a veteran of activism. He is the ACLU board member of the San Gabriel chapter, police reform advocate with CIO-PP, and was the recipient of Amnesty International's 2019 Urgent Letter Writer of the Year Award. Vincent will be discussing the false claims regarding Julian Assange and WikiLeaks' collusion with Russia that helped Trump to win help Trump win in 2016. We will also, more importantly in some ways, be dissecting an interview conducted by MSNBC's Chuck Todd in the midst of the 2016 election with Julian. But first, before we jump to that, I want to go back to 2010 and a very, very important point that Mr. Assange makes at the beginning of this process that I think resonates today, and we should continue to keep this in mind as we move forward through the rest of our program. Here we
An interesting note is that when I made the opening about the truth being the first casualty of war, we actually see that most wars that are started by democracies involve lying. Vietnam War and the Gulf of Tonkin incident involved lying. The start of the Iraq War involved very serious lies, which were repeated and amplified by some parts of the press. Which leads us to say what? Not that isn't the world terrible because there's a lot of lying by officials, but rather it leads us to a great hope that democracies don't start wars unless there's lies. So if there's enough truth early on enough, then perhaps we won't see these kind of wars.
And now I'm going to hand off the microphone to Vincent DeStefano.
All righty. In the clips you've watched and the one you will watch shortly, you see what Julian has had to face from all media, nearly all media outlets for more than a decade, As but one example, when you see Chuck Todd here, he asked about the most salacious comments possible. Now, there's been a large difference of opinion regarding Julian Assange and WikiLeaks on both the left and the right. Some of them see him as whistleblowing heroes telling the people what their governments wish to hide from them. Others consider them traitors, exposing state secrets, endangering lives, and working, as Robert just said, to ensure that Trump was elected in collusion with the Russian government. Before I continue, though, Robert, go ahead and play the Chuck Todd piece.
Well, joining me now is the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, who has been granted asylum at the Embassy of Ecuador in London. He is currently fighting extradition to Sweden because of rape charges, by the way, that he denies. Mr. Assange joins me now. Good morning, sir. Welcome to Meet the Press.
Good morning, Chuck. First, I'll have to, unfortunately, correct you for some sloppy journalism. I
Go
have
right
not
ahead,
been
sir.
charged with anything whatsoever, and I have already been previously cleared, and the UN has formally found this year that I am illegally detained in this embassy for the past 4 years.
We will correct the record and let your comments there speak for themselves.
Right there, right there. This is the first question that Chuck Todd asks about a rape charge. A rape charge, the most salacious and a disproven claim, along with many others. Now, I'm going to discuss right now how Julian, regardless of how many times these claims are debunked, like Dracula, they rise from their grave to reappear again and again. What we've seen here with 60 Minutes, with Chuck Todd and many other outlets is simply lazy investigative journalism, which is the métier of WikiLeaks. Whether Julian Assange is a civil libertarian hero or an anarchist troublemaker is largely a matter of opinion. However, what is not a matter of opinion are accusations made against Julian and WikiLeaks that are either based on weak, non-existent, but more often than not, blatantly false information. Now, one of the worst, most damning examples of that outside of the rape allegation is the false information, is the one that I just referred to, and that is Julian worked for and knowingly conspired with the Russian government to spread disinformation, lies, and that he actively worked against US interests with and at the behest of Vladimir Putin's government and their secret service, the GRU. Now, to those of us who still continue to repeat this canard, I wish to make you aware of the fact that as of today, not even the US government alleges that WikiLeaks knowingly coordinated with the Kremlin. It's just not true. WikiLeaks was not responsible for the 2016 publication of the Democratic Party emails, the one that supposedly, that everybody blames him for causing Hillary Clinton to lose the election. In point of fact, Robert Mueller's special counsel alleged only that Guccifer 2.0, an internet entity of very murky origin that spread damaging information to countless parties, including The Intercept, Politico, and The Hill, was a persona covertly operated by Russian conspirators, and that much is very true. However, that very same report went on years ago to exonerate Julian and WikiLeaks of working in any knowing or unknowing fashion with a Russian state entity. And yet these scurrilous and baseless accusations are brought up every time he's interviewed. Now, perhaps there's a reason for it, because it's not just coming from the right or from the press, it's also coming from liberal Americans. And perhaps many American liberals simply cannot forgive Assange for, in their minds, helping Donald Trump to become president. They conflate that belief with the mistaken notion that he did so because he was a Russian surrogate. Unfortunately, these two accusations lack any merit whatsoever. First, and most importantly, the Mueller report clearly shows that Hillary's private email servers were revealed in a Freedom of Information Act filed in 2012, not by WikiLeaks, but in point of fact by the nonprofit Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics crew. This release, which cost her the election, was not from WikiLeaks. Now, once this already available material was made public, it was made more searchable by both WikiLeaks and the Washington Post. And yet it is only Julian Assange that is sitting in Ballmash prison right now, not the folks from the Washington Post. But that's a far cry from what WikiLeaks is being accused of ad nauseum. Then when it comes to the Podesta emails, the second tranche, it turns out that they were revealed not by WikiLeaks either, or by any elaborate collusion with anybody. The sad truth is that this material from the Podesta emails was captured by a simple spear phishing operation. Now, spear phishing, for those of you that don't know it, is a criminal method that you've probably encountered. You get an email and it says, you need to check on your bank data, click on this link, and any moron would know that this was a false flag. What that means is that DNC's own lax server security and their own inability to protect themselves from ordinary run-of-the-mill internet hackers led directly to this release. And again, not WikiLeaks. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't mean that Russia did not attempt to interfere in our elections. Quite frankly, I believe they did, with a minor effect. Or that Vladimir Putin is an angel. I don't happen to believe he is. I believe he's a pretty terrible guy. Or that interference in our or anyone's elections by any government or any non-state entity is acceptable. It isn't. However, if you think back to the not so recent past, there's very clear evidence that the US or the Clinton administration is not blameless in regard. In fact, there's rock solid evidence that the Clinton administration itself interfered, and successfully so, in gaming its own Russian presidential election. They cleverly hid this interference. Well, they hid it in plain sight in the cover of the July 15th, 1996 cover of Time magazine. It features a lovely rendition of Boris Yeltsin alongside the title, "Yanks to the Rescue, Secret Story of How American Advisors Helped Yeltsin Win." Not too secret if it appears in the pages of Time magazine. Back then, the Clinton administration was proud of their illegal and immoral election interference, which ensured the election not only of a drunken buffoon, but ultimately Vladimir Putin himself. Apparently, when they do it, it's called supporting democracy. But when the tables are turned, it's a crime against humanity that is against all that is good in the world. And of course, it's WikiLeaks' fault. In light of their past election interference, the utter hypocrisy coming from Hillary Clinton and the DNC itself is mind-boggling, and their relentless attacks on WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and more importantly, the truth is shameful beyond belief. Now, the fact that Hillary Clinton lost, which I think was tragic for all of us and was a surprise to her, was one of the worst unqualified candidates in US history, required by all parties. They needed a convenient excuse involved in this epic failure. And Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were their convenient explanation. Now, mind you, not her failure to actually campaign in any of the 3 states where she lost the electoral college, not her war crimes in Honduras or in Libya, to name only 2 as Secretary of State, not her $600,000 speaking engagement to Goldman Sachs that she did not want to reveal, that when it was revealed, we hear her candidly telling her audience of financiers that they were the most qualified ones to run our country's financial system. And the same speech where she went on to say that she had one message for those financiers, an entirely different message that she would share with the unwashed masses that she needed to ensure her election. More importantly, not the fact that is borne out in the Mueller report itself that the geniuses who ran her campaign, and understandably so, really believed that Trump would be the best candidate for her to run against, or her own efforts in support of the Trump campaign towards that end. I could go on, but to be clear, that both Hillary and the DNC needed reasons other than their own ineptitude, failures, and rank stupidity to explain her unbelievable loss to Trump is another matter. Now, in the next clip you're going to see, the subject of RT comes up. On top of that, what the notion is that Julian was in the employ of the Russians because WikiLeaks had a show that was broadcast on RT-TV. Now, for those of you who don't know, RT stands for Russian television. It is funded by the Russian government, and it is a funded news service, much like the BBC. However, RT, like most media outlets, employs stringers or stringer programs. Again, if you're not familiar with this, these are correspondents who are not on the regular staff, but provide stories or programs for that interview. In this case, WikiLeaks, the show that appeared on RT, was independently produced in London and sold to at least 12 other media outlets for viewing on many platforms. This is very similar and is known many times as syndication, as a practice that nearly all content providers employ to simply increase their access to audience. In the end, after the dust is settled and the country has moved on from the epic failure of Russiagate, overcome with the horror that is the Trump administration, there still has not been one shred of credible evidence that Julian ever provided any assistance to the Russian government, knowing or unknowingly, or worked in collusion with them for any reason. And yet, every interview, it comes up again and again. In point of fact, WikiLeaks has actually published nearly 1 million documents exposing Russian government malfeasance, crimes, and actions they wish never to see the light of day. In addition to that, WikiLeaks has repeatedly and publicly defended Russian activists and dissidents, much to the displeasure of their supposed partners in crime. And more importantly, WikiLeaks has made very critical comments against the very government they've been accused of conspiring with. In 2017 alone, WikiLeaks published a mammoth tranche called the Russian Spy Files, exposing criminal surveillance practices. Simple logic dictates that releasing proof of criminal behavior and making repeated criminal public statements are not things you do with your partners in crime if you wish to remain partners very long. It's important to note that WikiLeaks has also released countless of documents relating to Syria, Lebanon, Kenya, Tunisia, and even Scientology, to name but a few of the folks that they have shown the public what they need to know. This list could go on and on and on, because WikiLeaks is not concerned with any particular political ends other than transparency. What WikiLeaks is concerned with is of paramount importance, in Julian's own words, quote, that what WikiLeaks publishes is 100% accurate, and that WikiLeaks will always protect their sources under all circumstances at any price, like any other investigative journalist. In one short sentence, you have there the ethos of WikiLeaks. With that in mind, please remember that WikiLeaks, since its inception, has never had to offer a retraction for anything they've ever released. I know of no other media outlet that can make that claim. So, to what or to whom do WikiLeaks owe their allegiance? WikiLeaks and Julian Assange's allegiance is really to all of us, regardless of our countries of origin. Again, in Julian's own words, their goal is justice and their method is transparency. With this simple, direct quote, Julian spells out WikiLeaks' modus operandi. Julian goes on to say, quote, "You have to start with the truth, because any decision-making that is based on lies, as he said about the lead up to wars, cannot lead to a good conclusion," end quote. WikiLeaks' release of source documents allows the public, us, to see what those documents actually say. We are then freed from having to rely on the spin by politicians or even media outlets that is used to hide the truth of lies by omission. He carries through further when he says, most power structures are deeply incompetent because secrecy breeds incompetence, end quote. WikiLeaks, by breaking that wall of security with the production of source documents and material, ensures that classification is not used to hide mistakes, malfeasance, or crimes under the guise of classification. From that premise, he states, understanding that, quote, understanding that means small and committed organizations can outmaneuver these institutional dinosaurs like the State Department, the NSA, the CIA, and quote, I might add the GRU. That is exactly what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have been doing since their inception. They have worked tirelessly to enlighten all of us about what our governments wish to hide from us. WikiLeaks and Julian Assange's goal is not limited to any one country, but is global. Therefore, they owe their allegiance to no state or any government. Rather, their allegiance is quite clearly, as he said, to truth and transparency. Their allegiance is to the people, all people's right to know what our governments are doing in our names and in our dimes. To punish Julian Assange or WikiLeaks and to repeat these lies ad nauseum for the work they do and the information they provide will be a crime of the highest order, and one, my friends, that history will judge us harshly if we fail to stand up, speak out, and activate ourselves to fight against for our own right to know. That's that.
Thank you, Vince. I'm going to play a couple different clips from the MSNBC interview with Chuck Todd and separated by just me coming back on and shifting on. So the first one, they're all related to what Vince is just elucidating here. So here's our first one right now.
Let me start with the WikiLeaks core mission. In the service that you have wanted it to perform, to speak truth to power. Are you concerned that when if a foreign government uses your entity, that you have now seen WikiLeaks get weaponized?
I think that the real question is, what is the legitimacy now, and what is the accountability of what has occurred within the Democratic campaign, where we have clear proof of sabotage? It's already seen one head resign. Our sources within the DNC say that they believe more heads are going to roll. But what about the election? What's the redress for the people that have effectively, one can argue, have had a candidate stolen from them as a result of corrupt practices within the DNC?
Are you hoping these leaks elect Donald Trump president?
It does. I mean, it's irrelevant. That's not why we publish. WikiLeaks, let's take a step back. WikiLeaks was founded 10 years ago. We have 100% track record for accuracy on the material we've published. We have published 11 million publications, including 650,000 that are about Russia, mostly critical, more than 2 million about the government of Syria, including Bashar al-Assad's personal emails. We don't have any concern as to whether Hillary is elected or Trump is elected. We're concerned that the material we publish is always accurate on the one hand, and that our sources are protected on it.
Okay, and now I'm going to jump to another one. This one sets up the issue and poses the question about RT and WikiLeaks.
You used to have a TV show on a media company called Russia Today, RT. It is a company that is run by the Russian government. They still promote your television show. I know you haven't done an episode in 4 years. Do you have any other financial arrangement with the Russian government beyond RT?
Well, okay. No, there's no financial arrangement. There's no one in this organization that is Russian or can even speak Russian. The TV show you're talking about, The World Tomorrow, worldtomorrow.wikileaks.org, it's a wholly independently produced TV show here in London with Dartmouth Films, a well-regarded London production company. We sold licenses to 12 broadcasters and newspapers around the world, including Russia Today. And that's the extent of the cooperation. They bought the license and they aggressively promoted it. And people in the Hillary Clinton camp have tried to seize on the one broadcaster bought a license from us in 2012 to suggest that there's some kind of connection, and that is false.
So the next video I'm going to play actually speaks to the allegations that have been forwarded and thrown into Julian's face over and over and over again about publishing content that may have come, quote unquote, from a foreign government. I'll let the video speak for itself.
Does that not trouble you at all if a foreign government is trying to meddle in the affairs of another foreign government?
Well, it's an interesting speculative question that's for the press and others to.
But that doesn't bother you? That is not part of the WikiLeaks.
Well, it's a meta story. If you're asking, would we accept information from U.S. intelligence that we had verified to be completely accurate, And would we publish that? And would we protect our sources in US intelligence? The answer is yes, of course we would.
Of course they would, because if people inside of the CIA or other government entities that have information that is damning to policies and procedures that are corrupt and in some cases deadly, of course that's his whole mission, is to do that. And so here's there are two more clips that I think are really important, and then I think we can all kind of process this. The next one is about allegations about how Julian manipulated the timings of his releases to influence an election. Let me jump into that. Give me one moment.
Are you timing your leaks? I know you have another, so there's a lot of speculation that you have more information from what was taken from the DNC. Are you timing your leaks for maximum impact on the Clinton campaign?
We're timing our leaks to make sure that A, that they're verified, that we keep a 100% track record, B, that they're formatted, indexed in a position where investigative journalists can use them, the public can use them, where lawyers can use them as pristine documents, where prosecutors can use them. We have a great track record of contributing to hundreds of legal cases and prosecutions, let alone what happens in terms of political accountability. That's how we choose our timing. As soon as we're done, as soon as we're ready, as soon as we're confident in our material, and when there's a position where we know that the public is interested, that's when we release.
And one more in this sequence.
Current supporters of your mission are concerned that you release too much information, that you allow civilians who are not part of this, you allow too much of their private information out. There was a release of information, for instance, on Turkish citizens that was about the government, but it ended up releasing a whole bunch of personal information on millions of women in Turkey, for instance. Are you going to reconsider your protocols and redact information that would just harm civilians unfairly?
I'm glad you brought up that Turkish case, because it is simply false. We did not publish any such information at any time in any manner whatsoever. It's simply a false story. It is being promoted by the Clinton campaign in order to distract from the revelation of corruption within the DNC.
So here in the series of clips and what Vince so well put, we see that the attacks on Julian Assange have been over time, over 10 years, have been pervasive, have been consistent. It comes from the right, it comes from the left, because the issue is he is speaking truth. And it's the truth that creates the biggest scuffle in all of this, because they don't know how to deal with the truth. We saw the truth earlier on. We saw the truth of the massacre that was documented by the US military itself, from the gun sights of an Apache helicopter slaughtering people. And what you don't see in that video, which is actually 40 minutes long, I cut it out for time, but I think it's important to understand, there were 3 war crimes that happened in the midst of that scene. And the one that we didn't quite see was essentially at the end of this conflagration or turkey shoot, as the US military ground forces started moving into this little neighborhood, literally the vehicles came through and rolled over decimated bodies in their quest to establish order in the midst of the chaos that they themselves had created. And then the same helicopter gunship, not long after this, we see them fire 2 Hellfire missiles into a building where there were no people. It was just and you could see them literally destroying people on the streets walking by. So it becomes, the truth here is what is critical for us to understand. And this video that Assange released was powerful in its impact and continues to shake the the foundations of the surveillance state. Because when this kind of stuff is released, it changes the game for everybody. And we owe that to Julian. We also owe that to Chelsea Manning for her efforts to bring this material to Julian so he could publish it. That is the process that Julian has created. That is the process that he is being tortured, imprisoned, and punished for right now. On another note, and there's so much discussion and critique of Assange as not being a journalist. But if anyone who has spent any time or had the opportunity to interface with him intellectually knows straight out that Assange is a powerful intellect. And within that, he has a sense of history, of politics, of new media that's truly amazing to see coming out of this very understated person. Now, there may be personality issues that people have problems with. Oh, he's a narcissist. Oh, he's a rapist. All these things that have been played over and over and over again. But the bottom line is Assange has been committed to raising the bar when it comes to, excuse me, understanding the broader world around us. My experience, I'm going to shift into what my experience was with Julian directly, was in 2016, I was asked to interview Julian Assange and a host of others while producing a documentary about the Armenian genocide. And in the process of this, I learned a little bit about Julian, and of course, genocide in general is the subject matter of what WikiLeaks is working on. They are trying to expose the lies of the past, present, and potentially, and will hopefully reduce the lies that we are subjected to in the future. So this becomes, this came into play in my research, and as I understood more about the Armenian genocide, I was able to contact Julian, and I set up an interview with him in the Ecuadorian embassy. And he basically laid out a whole lot of very fascinating information about Turkey, about the US government, and how genocide denial in terms of the Armenian genocide still plays a game today, whether it's a democratic regime or a Republican. They still play this game of denial to placate Turkey and to maintain a positive relationship, quote unquote, with the dictatorial regime of Erdogan. So with that said, I'm going to play a block of material that came from this documentary I worked on. It was one of the producers called Architects of Denial. And give me a moment and I will play it. Here we go.
The United States sees Turkey as one of the most important countries in the world geostrategically. You can see that nakedly from our cable release. The greatest number of cables is from Ankara because of the central place that Turkey plays within the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. It is the point that connects all these other points. In fact, that's why Turkey became such a powerful empire, was because of this central geostrategic position.
The Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan's visit to Washington took a turn for the worst after his security officers clashed with journalists covering his visit.
It's only been because the Jewish diaspora has managed to do well in New York, London, and Paris, that they are able to demand accountability for the Jewish genocide. And part of the reason now that finally the Armenian genocide is having some attention drawn to it is for the same reason, that the Armenian diaspora is starting to do well in major Western capitals and is able to push for its right. A good example of how Europe and the United States, in acceding to Turkey's demands to not recognize the Armenian genocide, has emboldened it in other forms of human rights suppression, is its suppression of the Kurds. In particular, the total destruction of the largest Kurdish language TV station, ROJ TV.
Kurdish language television channel accused of supporting terrorism is being prosecuted in Denmark after years of pressure from the Turkish government. Roj TV is accused of helping to promote the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, known as the PKK, a group considered to be a terrorist organization by Turkey, the US, and the EU.
ROJ TV was based in Denmark, beaming up to Eurosat and down into the Kurdish regions. The Danish Prime Minister wanted to become head of NATO, Rasmussen. In a plot documented in our cables between Barack Obama, Turkey, and Denmark, they all agreed to censor ROJ TV by finding mechanisms within the Danish legal system to do it, whether it was based on their content, not being accurate enough, or going after them on taxation. The deal was that if ROJ TV was wiped out, the largest Kurdish language broadcaster was wiped out by Denmark, then Rasmussen would become the head of NATO. Turkey would remove its veto, and the United States would also get what it wanted by having this Dane, very sympathetic to the United States, be head of NATO.
Court in Copenhagen's fined a Kurdish language TV based there €400,000 for making propaganda for a terrorist organisation. The Danes say the propaganda was in support of the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK.
And we don't have a land, okay? We don't have a territory. We had just a television. And today, thank you, we don't have anything. So that's why we are here.
That's exactly what happened. And the cables documenting that are now being used in the European Court of Human Rights by ROJ TV. So acceding to these outlandish Turkish demands to deny a very well-documented historical fact has let Turkey understand that it can be a diplomatic bully and achieve power success in a variety of areas. Turkey has rapidly moved towards an aggressive new form of nationalism in order for Erdogan and his party to cement their control over the military and intelligence sectors, the hard power of the state within Turkey. Having seen the success of that, they have continued on trying to incite further nationalism within Turkey and using Armenia and the Kurds as symbols that must be fought against, using them as external enemies of some kind to rally the Turkish population together. When Turkey is unified and is able to say, look, unless you do what we want, we are going to approach Israel in a different way. We're going to approach Syria in a different way. We're going to approach the Russians in a different way. We're going to approach Europe in a different way. It is able to extort all sorts of concessions from Europe and the United States. And it's done exactly that in relation to the Armenian genocide.
And just a postscript to that, I think what this clip and this sequence really shows is the power of WikiLeaks to inform high quality documentary filmmaking, high quality news production, and to get a broader, deeper historical and contemporary understanding of what is happening around the world in terms of these kinds of issues. Next up, we're going to have Jason Fuller is going to come back on. And he's going to be talking to us about the redaction protocols and such that Assange and WikiLeaks has been employing. The question, of course, is, is he a hero or a reckless hacker? That is the theme that we're going to talk about here. But first, I want to pull one more clip from the Steve Croft interview with Assange which starts out truly hilarious in how dismissive it is of Assange and what he's doing.
Are you a subversive?
I'm sure there are certain views amongst Hillary Clinton and her lot that we are subverting their authority. But you're right. We are subverting illegitimate authority. The question is whether the authority is legitimate or whether it's illegitimate.
Do you consider the US State Department a legitimate authority?
It's legitimate insofar as its actions are legitimate. It has actions that are not legitimate.
And you've gone after the ones that you think are illegitimate.
We don't go after. That's a bit of a misconception. We don't go after a particular country. We don't go after a particular organization or group. We just stick to our promise of publishing material that is likely to have a significant impact.
To increase the impact of the US documents, Assange decided to share them with some of the leading news organizations in the world, including the New York Times, a relationship that grew testy when Assange published the first set of war logs without removing the names of Afghans who were cooperating with US forces. The most persistent criticism from within the press has been that you have behaved recklessly from time to time. And the example that they cite is that you decided to release Afghan documents without redacting the names of people who had provided intelligence to the US government.
There's no evidence or any credible allegation, or even any allegation from an official body, that we have caused any individual at any time to come to harm in the past 4 years.
The Pentagon said that they've gone through all of these documents and they found the names of 300 people.
Well, that's new public information to us. It's possible that there are 300 names in the publicly released Afghan material. We don't pretend that that process is absolutely perfect. We did hold back 1 in 5 documents for extra harm minimization review. And we also improved our process. So when Iraq came around, there was not even a single name in it.
I mean, there have been reports, people quoting Taliban leaders saying that they had the names of these people and that they were going to take retribution.
The Taliban is not a coherent outfit, but we don't say that it's absolutely impossible that anything we ever publish will ever result in harm. We cannot say that.
There's a perception on the part of some people who believe that your agenda right now is anti-American.
Not at all. In fact, our founding values are those of the US Revolution. They are those of people like Jefferson and Madison. And we have a number of Americans in our organization. If you're a whistleblower and you have material that is important, we will accept it, we will defend you, and we will publish it. You can't turn away material simply because it comes from the United States.
After the release of the State Department cables, Attorney General Eric Holder condemned WikiLeaks for putting national security at risk.
I think there's a real basis, there's a predicate for us to believe that crimes have been committed here. And
Holder announced that the Justice Department and the Pentagon were conducting a criminal investigation. They are reportedly looking at the Espionage Act of 1917 and other statutes to find a way to prosecute Assange and extradite him to the US.
It's completely outrageous.
Are you surprised?
I am surprised, actually.
But you are screwing with the forces of nature. You have made some of the most powerful people in the world your enemies. You had to expect that they might retaliate.
I fully expected they retaliate.
You gathered, you stored all sorts of classified cables and documents and then released them to the world on the internet. They see that as a threat. And they want to...
Well, they see it as highly embarrassing. I think what it's really about is keeping the illusion of control. I'm not surprised about that. I'm surprised at how the sort of flagrant disregard for US traditions. That is what I'm surprised at.
And now Nathan is going to return and give us his next little block of information.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yeah, so first of all, Steve Croft, I think, kind of sneakily conflates US government propaganda with what he says is media consensus. He says that the most persistent criticism among media figures of Assange is that he's reckless. No, the most persistent criticism among media, especially at the time, is more likely that he's a narcissist, or as Croft said in that earlier segment, that he's a weirdo or paranoid. But the criticism that Assange is reckless, that he put lives at risk, this is coming from the State Department. This is propaganda that they're counting on in their effort to extradite him to the UK. What actually happened, and we don't just have to take WikiLeaks' word for any of this, because it's also been independently corroborated by journalists who worked with WikiLeaks since 2010, especially on these initial publications. They've talked about the fact that WikiLeaks was actually very serious about redactions. They refer to what Julian refers to as an opt-in process. And by that, he means WikiLeaks used a coding script to automatically redact all names from the Iraq war logs, then go back and see if any should be unredacted. Other journalists have said it publicly, and I think we're going to hear more about this as Julian's extradition hearing resumes in September in London, that Assange redacted even more than some other journalists wanted. Assange was engaged in communications with the State Department and the other agencies in the US government about redactions, and in their initial redactions, WikiLeaks actually redacted even more than they did. And so now we have the benefit of hindsight. This is nearly a decade later to know that what Assange says here does hold true. In 2013, I reported from Chelsea Manning's court-martial trial down in Fort Meade, and the government had to say on the record under oath that it could not find any evidence that anyone named in WikiLeaks documents was killed as a result of the publication. They did talk about, bin Laden and Taliban figures and Al-Qaeda talking about WikiLeaks just as Steve Croft did there. And so it's really interesting to see that conflation happen. But they were not able to cite any actual evidence of anyone harmed as a result. And since then, that was in 2013. Since then, in the years since, BuzzFeed journalist Jason Leopold has made several FOIA requests for the WikiLeaks damage assessments. And these are the government reports on damage that they say came as a result of the releases. And over, he's put out several of these assessments in 2017 and 2019 in particular. And over, they say the same thing, that no one they can say is harmed as a result of these releases. But this is a really useful government tactic for several reasons. I mean, for the people who won't bother to look into the details, it sounds like a really bad, dangerous thing. It sounds like Assange is reckless or doesn't care and has blood on his hands. That's what the words they used at the time. Just a big enough section of the population is just too willing to believe what the government says without any question. But even for those who do look into it, it directs attention away yet again from the real blood on their hands. Here in these releases is hard proof of detestable war crimes in which US soldiers are murdering innocent Iraqi civilians, in some cases execution style, and you should look that up. And this is not prosecuted. These war crimes are not prosecuted. What the US has done to Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 years is an ongoing, disgusting crime. And here we have a debate over whether a couple sources are named. Do you actually think the US cares about Iraqis or Afghans named and are now at risk? This is the same US government that is occupying their countries against their will, trampling their sovereignty, killing them with abandon. No, the US wants you focused on this little debate so that you don't pay attention to the blood on its hands. And we cannot allow journalists to assist them in that propaganda effort.
Thank you, Nathan. Our next speaker is Marjorie Cohen, who is a criminal defense attorney, professor emerita at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law. She's also a former president of the National Lawyers Guild. She writes often. Her work can be seen on Truth Out and in other progressive publications around the country. And before we go there, Marjorie's actually going to talk more about the present persecution in this very Orwellian world of Julian Assange in a prison, essentially in a dungeon in London. Before Marjorie steps in, we're going to play a clip of Julian speaking to the circular logic of how the government in London in the UK is dealing with his situation. Give me one brief moment. Okay, there it is. And here we go.
Are you a subversive?
I'm sure there are certain views amongst Hillary Clinton and her lot.
Excuse me, that was the wrong video. Give me one moment.
If we look in my particular situation, okay, yes, everyone understands there's a vast political and geopolitical dynamic that's intimately connected with the United States. But it is instrumentalized in practice by UK intelligence services and police who will physically arrest me and hold me for whatever the US wants to do with me. So what is the excuse to actually do that, to enable those budget spends? The excuse is, in a case that I was never charged for, where the extradition warrant has already been dropped, where I repeatedly won, they say that they're going to keep around the warrant, the UK end of the warrant, for the Swedish extradition, which I won. They're going to keep around that warrant despite me winning that, because I came in here, and perhaps they might want to, they haven't, but perhaps they might want to charge me with a bail violation. This is the technical excuse. They haven't. Twice the UK courts have refused to do so. Why? Well, because if you move your house arrest location to pursue a parallel legal process, a higher legal process, which is an asylum application, that's not a bail violation. Okay, but what if it was? What if you disagree with that analysis and you say that is a bail violation? Well, okay, even before I came into this embassy and applied for asylum, which is everyone's right, everyone in this audience, if you are generally being persecuted, even before I came in this embassy, you add up the time in prison under a very grueling house arrest for 18 months. I've already done 3 times the maximum amount of time under UK sentencing legislation. UK sentencing legislation values house arrest at 50% of prison time. That's the law. So there's, not only is this a bogus warrant that it has no purpose, if you, as the judge did a couple of weeks ago, they say, well, maybe if he came to court, I might want to charge him. So that's why I need to keep that warrant around. Okay, but if that occurred, there could be no possible prison time because I've already served more than 3 times the maximum possible prison time, even before I was awarded asylum. If you include the time in the embassy, which you should, because the UN has assessed it and said, if you legally block someone from leaving the country, that's a form of detention. That would be 10 times the amount. So the real question is, when is the UK government going to uphold the treaty obligations that it has signed and uphold basic justice principles within UK law?
And now Marjorie Cohen.
Thank you. After WikiLeaks published damning evidence of the United States commission of war crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo prison, the US government mounted a full court press to discredit and vilify Julian Assange. It worked with the Swedish and UK governments to detain him on trumped-up charges of sexual assault with the likely goal of extraditing him to the United States. Assange was granted asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and he remained there for 7 years. When a US-friendly government came to power in Ecuador, the new president lifted Assange's grant of asylum and turned him over to the UK. He was convicted of a bail violation and sentenced to 1 year in a UK jail. That charge was a minor offense, but his unconscionable sentence gave the US time to go after him. The Obama administration had refrained from indicting Assange for fear of establishing a precedent that could chill investigative reporting about national security matters by treating it as a crime, according to Charlie Savage of the New York Times. Obama's government had difficulty distinguishing between what WikiLeaks did and what traditional news media organizations like the Times do in soliciting and publishing information they obtain that the government wants to keep secret, Savage wrote. News organizations, including the Times, published articles that drew on documents WikiLeaks had published in 2010, including logs of significant combat events in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, according to Savage. The Trump administration, however, engaged in no such forbearance as the Obama administration had. The US government indicted him under the Espionage Act and asked the UK to extradite him to the US for trial on the indictment. He faces 170 years in prison if convicted. Like the heroic whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, Assange is the victim of the US government's wrath for revealing evidence of war crimes by the United States. Meanwhile, Assange has been subjected to torture. In spite of his serious health conditions, when Assange was living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, the UK government refused to allow him to go to a hospital with the threat of arrest hanging over his head. Last year, UN Special Rapporteur Niles Meltzer declared that Assange had exhibited signs of prolonged exposure to psychological torture. Since he's been in the London prison, he is in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, which is, it's well established that constitutes torture. And the hour that he is not in solitary, he is packed together with 4 other inmates, giving him the opportunity and the vulnerability to contract the COVID-19 virus. So Assange's increased risk includes his ongoing psychological torture, his history of medical neglect, his fragile health. He has a very serious lung condition, chronic lung disease. The Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment is a treaty the US and the UK have ratified. That convention has a provision called non-refoulement that forbids extradition to a country where there are substantial grounds to believe a person would be in danger of being tortured. When Chelsea Manning was arrested for providing documents of these war crimes to WikiLeaks in 2010, she was held in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day for 11 months, and she was forced to stand naked for inspection. And the former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture said that her treatment was at a minimum cruel, inhuman, and degrading, and possibly constituted torture, but he was not allowed access to the information that would have confirmed that. A country also has a duty to refuse extradition when it would violate fundamental rights, such as the right to be free from torture and cruel treatment. The Johannesburg Principles of National Security, Freedom of Expression, and Access to Information say no person may be punished on national security grounds for disclosure of information if the public interest in knowing the information outweighs the harm from the disclosure. The US and UK have an extradition treaty that they concluded in 2003, and it states, extradition shall not be granted if the offense for which extradition is requested is a political offense. It is the requested state, in this case the UK, that determines whether or not the request by the US was politically motivated. There is no clear definition of political offense, but it routinely includes treason, sedition, and espionage, and offenses directed against state power. Assange published true information obtained from a whistleblower, making the charges against him political in nature rather than criminal. As Glenn Greenwald wrote in The Intercept, Assange faces no charges of any kind other than the attempt to extradite him by the US government for those 2010 publications. There are no charges pending against him in Sweden, nor does this prosecution have anything to do with WikiLeaks publications during the 2016 election. The indictment pertains solely to those widely celebrated 2010 disclosures that revealed rampant war crimes, systemic corruption, and official deceit by numerous governments around the world. When Assange's lawyers requested that he be released on bail because of his vulnerability to the coronavirus while he is in custody on the bail charge in London, their request was denied in a March 25th hearing, and the judge Barrister ruled that Assange was a flight risk and couldn't be trusted to be released. She repeated hearsay that he would prefer suicide to extradition and tipped her hand by saying that he had a high risk of extradition. So here we have a judge that is holding hearings about whether or not he should be extradited to the United States, and she says that he has a high risk of extradition. It sounds to me like she's prejudged the case. Now, Assange's full extradition hearing is scheduled to take place on September the 7th. There will be another administrative hearing on June 29th, where both sides will present psychiatric reports and other information. Assange's lawyers have not had adequate access to their client. Journalists have struggled to cover the case because of barely audible phone links to administrative hearings. Now, if after his extradition hearing, which concludes in September, the judge determines that extradition should take place, extradition to the United States to face this indictment on the Espionage Act charges, then there's an automatic appeal of that extradition decision to the magistrate court, then to the UK High Court, then the Court of Appeal, and then the European Court of Human Rights. The same day as Assange's bail hearing, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, called on authorities to release prisoners who are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. She said, now more than ever, governments should release every person detained without sufficient legal basis, including political prisoners and others detained simply for expressing critical or dissenting views. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. We're almost done with our program. We're just bumping up against our 90 minutes, but we have a couple small things to do still. First off, I want to thank everyone who's participated. I think it's been a very effective collection of information and voices. But I think we have to emphasize one more thing. Again, Julian Assange is being essentially imprisoned for telling the truth. Just let that sink in again in a time where we are facing political regimes that feed themselves on lies. And so here we have this man who revealed something profoundly disturbing and necessary to expose. And he is now being treated as a leper, stowed away in some dungeon in London. And now the United States is threatening to remove him and send him. It's a horrifying story. And I wish we had the ability to speak directly to Julian right now, but given the circumstances, we do not. In lieu of that, we have a brief video that we produced featuring Jennifer Robinson, who is one of Julian's attorneys in the UK, who has been a steadfast supporter and advocate for his work and his mission, and in this case, for his life. So here are a few words from Jennifer Robinson, and we're getting very close to wrapping up our program. Thank you.
The case against Julian Assange sets a dangerous precedent for journalists and editors everywhere. Julian now faces 175 years in prison for publications which revealed evidence of war crimes, torture, and human rights abuse. Julian and WikiLeaks have won numerous awards the world over for this important work. The material was published together with more than 100 media partners around the world, including The Guardian, The New York Times, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, El País, and so many others. For now, Julian is the only person who's facing prosecution for publishing this material. But as we've warned since 2010, this is a precedent that can and will be used against editors and journalists everywhere. In this case, the United States government is setting up a precedent whereby any journalist or editor anywhere in the world that publishes truthful information in the public interest about the United States could face extradition and prosecution in the United States. What does this say to other countries like China or Russia? How would we react if Saudi Arabia sought to extradite a British or American journalist to face prosecution in Saudi Arabia for having published information about Saudi Arabia? Already, we're seeing Bolsonaro's Brazil using the case theory that the United States is using against Julian Assange to prosecute American journalist Glenn Greenwald. Who will be next? Julian is now in a high security prison here in London, where I have to go to visit him. He's asked me to pass on his sincere thanks to all of you, to the supporters that continue to turn up to protests and continue to support the work of the Courage Foundation. Thanks for your work.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this presentation. If you'd like more information, please go to defend.wikileaks.org. We encourage you to stay plugged in, and this organization will continue to provide you information as new information appears. And I would suggest that everyone look at the parallels between what is happening today and all across the world, because someone provided us with truthful videos. Can you imagine the slippery slope if we were to allow this to move forward? Thank you again, and we hope to see you soon.